An hour later, he was in St. Petersburg, and by 10 o'clock, he had rung the bell at Rogojin's. He had gone to the front door, and was kept waiting a long while before anyone came. At last the door of old Mrs. Rogojin's flat was opened, and an aged servant appeared. "Parfen Semyonovitch is not at home," she announced from the doorway. "Whom do you want?" "Parfen Semyonovitch." "He is not in." The old woman examined the prince from head to foot with great curiosity. "At all events, tell me whether he slept at home last night, and whether he came alone." The old woman continued to stare at him, but said nothing. "Was not Nastasia Philipovna here with him yesterday evening?" "And pray, who are you yourself?" "Prince Lef Nicolaievitch Muishkin. He knows me well." "He is not at home." The woman lowered her eyes. "And Nastasia Philipovna?" "I know nothing about it." "Stop a minute. When will he come back?" "I don't know that either." The door was shut with these words, and the old woman disappeared. The prince decided to come back within an hour. Passing out of the house, he met the porter. "Is Parfen Semyonovitch at home?" he asked. "Yes." "Why did they tell me he was not at home then?" "Where did they tell you so? At his door?" "No, at his mother's flat. I rang at Parfen Semyonovitch's door and nobody came." "Well, he may have gone out." "I can't tell. Sometimes he takes the keys with him and leaves the rooms empty for 2 or 3 days." "Do you know for certain that he was at home last night?" "Yes, he was." "Was Nastasia Philipovna with him?" "I don't know, she doesn't come often." "I think I should have known if she had come." The prince went out deep in thought and walked up and down the pavement for some time. The windows of all the rooms occupied by Rogojin were closed. Those of his mother's apartments were open. It was a hot, bright day. The prince crossed the road in order to have a good look at the windows again. Not only were Rogojin's closed, but the white blinds were all down as well. He stood there for a minute, and then, suddenly and strangely enough, it seemed to him that a little corner of one of the blinds was lifted, and Rogojin's face appeared for an instant and then vanished. He waited another minute and decided to go and ring the bell once more. However, he thought better of it again and put it off for an hour. The chief object in his mind at this moment was to get as quickly as he could to Nastasia Philipovna's lodging. He remembered that, not long since, when she had left Pavlovsk at his request, he had begged her to put up in town at the house of a respectable widow, who had well-furnished rooms to let near the Ismailovsky barracks. Probably Nastasia had kept the rooms when she came down to Pavlovsk this last time, and most likely she would have spent the night in them, Rogojin having taken her straight there from the station. The prince took a droshky. It struck him as he drove on that he ought to have begun by coming here, since it was most improbable that Rogojin should have taken Nastasia to his own house last night. He remembered that the porter said she very rarely came at all, so that it was still less likely that she would have gone there so late at night. Vainly trying to comfort himself with these reflections, the prince reached the Ismailovsky barracks more dead than alive. To his consternation, the good people at the lodgings had not only heard nothing of Nastasia, but all came out to look at him as if he were a marvel of some sort. The whole family of all ages surrounded him, and he was begged to enter. He guessed at once that they knew perfectly well who he was, and that yesterday ought to have been his wedding day, and further that they were dying to ask about the wedding, and especially about why he should be here now, inquiring for the woman who in all reasonable human probability might have been expected to be with him in Pavlovsk. He satisfied their curiosity in as few words as possible with regard to the wedding, but their exclamations and sighs were so numerous and sincere that he was obliged to tell the whole story, in a short form, of course. The advice of all these agitated ladies was that the prince should go at once and knock at Rogojin's until he was let in, and when let in insist upon a substantial explanation of everything. If Rogojin was really not at home, the prince was advised to go to a certain house, the address of which was given, where lived a German lady, a friend of Nastasia Philipovna's. It was possible that she might have spent the night there in her anxiety to conceal herself. The prince rose from his seat in a condition of mental collapse. The good ladies reported afterwards that his pallor was terrible to see and his legs seemed to give way underneath him. With difficulty, he was made to understand that his new friends would be glad of his address in order to act with him if possible. After a moment's thought, he gave the address of the small hotel, on the stairs of which he had had a fit some 5 weeks since. He then set off once more for Rogojin's. This time they neither opened the door at Rogojin's flat nor at the one opposite. The prince found the porter with difficulty, but when found, the man would hardly look at him or answer his questions, pretending to be busy. Eventually, however, he was persuaded to reply so far as to state that Rogojin had left the house early in the morning and gone to Pavlovsk, and that he would not return today at all. "I shall wait, he may come back this evening. He may not be home for a week." Then, at all events, he did sleep here, did he? Well, he did sleep here, yes. All this was suspicious and unsatisfactory. Very likely the porter had received new instructions during the interval of the prince's absence. His manner was so different now. He had been obliging, now he was as obstinate and silent as a mule. However, the prince decided to call again in a couple of hours, and after that to watch the house in case of need. His hope was that he might yet find Nastasia at the address which he had just received. To that address he now set off at full speed. But alas, at the German lady's house, they did not even appear to understand what he wanted. After a while, by means of certain hints, he was able to gather that Nastasia must have had a quarrel with her friend 2 or 3 weeks ago, since which date the latter had neither heard nor seen anything of her. He was given to understand that the subject of Nastasia's present whereabouts was not of the slightest interest to her, and that Nastasia might marry all the princes in the world for all she cared. So Muishkin took his leave hurriedly. It struck him now that she might have gone away to Moscow just as she had done the last time, and that Rogojin had perhaps gone after her, or even with her. If only he could find some trace. However, he must take his room at the hotel, and he started off in that direction. Having engaged his room, he was asked by the waiter whether he would take dinner. Replying mechanically in the affirmative, he sat down and waited, but it was not long before it struck him that dining would delay him. Enraged at this idea, he started up, crossed the dark passage, which filled him with horrible impressions and gloomy forebodings, and set out once more for Rogojin's. Rogojin had not returned, and no one came to the door. He rang at the old lady's door opposite, and was informed that Parfen Semyonovitch would not return for 3 days. The curiosity with which the old servant stared at him again impressed the prince disagreeably. He could not find the porter this time at all. As before, he crossed the street and watched the windows from the other side, walking up and down in anguish of soul for half an hour or so in the stifling heat. Nothing stirred, the blinds were motionless. Indeed, the prince began to think that the apparition of Rogojin's face could have been nothing but fancy. Soothed by this thought, he drove off once more to his friends at the Ismailovsky barracks. He was expected there. The mother had already been to 3 or 4 places to look for Nastasia, but had not found a trace of any kind. The prince said nothing, but entered the room, sat down silently, and stared at them, one after the other, with the air of a man who cannot understand what is being said to him. It was strange, one moment he seemed to be so observant, the next so absent. His behavior struck all the family as most remarkable. At length he rose from his seat and begged to be shown Nastasia's rooms. The ladies reported afterwards how he had examined everything in the apartments. He observed an open book on the table, Madame Bovary, and requested the leave of the lady of the house to take it with him. He had turned down the leaf at the open page, and pocketed it before they could explain that it was a library book. He had then seated himself by the open window, and seeing a card table, he asked who played cards. He was informed that Nastasia used to play with Rogojin every evening, either at preference, or little fool, or whist. That this had been their practice since her last return from Pavlovsk. That she had taken to this amusement because she did not like to see Rogojin sitting silent and dull for whole evenings at a time. That the day after Nastasia had made a remark to this effect, Rogojin had whipped a pack of cards out of his pocket. Nastasia had laughed, but soon they began playing. The prince asked where were the cards, but was told that Rogojin used to bring a new pack every day, and always carried it away in his pocket. The good ladies recommended the prince to try knocking at Rogojin's once more, not at once, but in the evening. Meanwhile, the mother would go to Pavlovsk to inquire at Dana Alexeyevna's whether anything had been heard of Nastasia there. The prince was to come back at 10 o'clock and meet her, to hear her news and arrange plans for the morrow. In spite of the kindly meant consolations of his new friends, the prince walked to his hotel in inexpressible anguish of spirit, through the hot, dusty streets, aimlessly staring at the faces of those who passed him. Arrived at his destination, he determined to rest a while in his room before he started for Rogojin's once more. He sat down, rested his elbows on the table and his head on his hands, and fell to thinking. Heaven knows how long and upon what subjects he thought. He thought of many things, of Vera Lebedev and of her father, of Hippolyte, of Rogojin himself, first at the funeral, then as he had met him in the park, then, suddenly, as they had met in this very passage, outside, when Rogojin had watched in the darkness and awaited him with uplifted knife. The prince remembered his enemy's eyes, as they had glared at him in the darkness. He shuddered as a sudden idea struck him. This idea was that if Rogojin were in Petersburg, though he might hide for a time, yet he was quite sure to come to him, the prince, before long, with either good or evil intentions, but probably with the same intention as on that other occasion. At all events, if Rogojin were to come at all, he would be sure to seek the prince here. He had no other town address, perhaps in the same corridor. He might well seek him here if he needed him. And perhaps he did need him. This idea seemed quite natural to the prince, though he could not have explained why he should so suddenly have become necessary to Rogojin. Rogojin would not come if all were well with him, that was part of the thought. He would come if all were not well. And certainly, undoubtedly, all would not be well with him. The prince could not bear this new idea. He took his hat and rushed out towards the street. It was almost dark in the passage. What if he were to come out of that corner as I go by and stop me? Thought the prince as he approached the familiar spot. But no one came out. He passed under the gateway and into the street. The crowds of people walking about, as is always the case at sunset in Petersburg during the summer, surprised him, but he walked on in the direction of Rogojin's house. About 50 yards from the hotel, at the first crossroad, as he passed through the crowd of foot passengers sauntering along, someone touched his shoulder and said in a whisper into his ear, "Lef Nicolaievitch, my friend, come along with me." It was Rogojin. The prince immediately began to tell him, eagerly and joyfully, how he had but the moment before expected to see him in the dark passage of the hotel. "I was there," said Rogojin unexpectedly. "Come along." The prince was surprised at this answer, but his astonishment increased a couple of minutes afterwards when he began to consider it. Having thought it over, he glanced at Rogojin in alarm. The latter was striding along a yard or so ahead, looking straight in front of him, and mechanically making way for anyone he met. "Why did you not ask for me at my room if you were in the hotel?" asked the prince, suddenly. Rogojin stopped and looked at him, then reflected and replied as though he had not heard the question. "Look here, Lef Nicolaievitch, you go straight on to the house. I shall walk on the other side. See that we keep together." So saying, Rogojin crossed the road. Arrived on the opposite pavement, he looked back to see whether the prince were moving, waved his hand in the direction of the Gorohovia, and strode on, looking across every moment to see whether Muishkin understood his instructions. The prince supposed that Rogojin desired to look out for someone whom he was afraid to miss. But if so, why had he not told him whom to look out for? So the two proceeded for half a mile or so. Suddenly, the prince began to tremble from some unknown cause. He could not bear it, and signaled to Rogojin across the road. The latter came at once. "Is Nastasia Philipovna at your house?" "Yes." "And was it, you looked out of the window, under the blind this morning?" "Yes." "Then why did—" But the prince could not finish his question. He did not know what to say. Besides this, his heart was beating so that he found it difficult to speak at all. Rogojin was silent also and looked at him as before, with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. "Well, I'm going," he said at last, preparing to recross the road. "You go along here as before. We will keep to different sides of the road. It's better so, you'll see." When they reached the Gorohovaya and came near the house, the prince's legs were trembling so that he could hardly walk. It was about 10 o'clock. The old lady's windows were open, as before. Rogojin's were all shut, and in the darkness the white blinds showed whiter than ever. Rogojin and the prince each approached the house on his respective side of the road. Rogojin, who was on the near side, beckoned the prince across. He went over to the doorway. "Even the porter does not know that I have come home now. I told him and told them at my mother's too that I was off to Pavlovsk," said Rogojin with a cunning and almost satisfied smile. "We'll go in quietly, and nobody will hear us." He had the key in his hand. Mounting the staircase, he turned and signaled to the prince to go more softly. He opened the door very quietly, let the prince in, followed him, locked the door behind him, and put the key in his pocket. "Come along," he whispered. He had spoken in a whisper all the way. In spite of his apparent outward composure, he was evidently in a state of great mental agitation. Arrived in a large salon, next to the study, he went to the window and cautiously beckoned the prince up to him. "When you rang the bell, this morning I thought it must be you. I went to the door on tiptoe and heard you talking to the servant opposite. Had told her before that if anyone came and rang, especially you, and I gave her your name, she was not to tell about me. Then I thought, what if he goes and stands opposite and looks up, or waits about to watch the house? So I came to this very window, looked out, and there you were staring straight at me. That's how it came about." "Where is Nastasia Philipovna?" asked the prince breathlessly. "She's here," replied Rogojin slowly after a slight pause. "Where?" Rogojin raised his eyes and gazed intently at the prince. "Come," he said. He continued to speak in a whisper, very deliberately as before, and looked strangely thoughtful and dreamy. Even while he told the story of how he had peeped through the blind, he gave the impression of wishing to say something else. They entered the study. In this room, some changes had taken place since the prince last saw it. It was now divided into two equal parts by a heavy green silk curtain stretched across it, separating the alcove beyond, where stood Rogojin's bed, from the rest of the room. The heavy curtain was drawn now, and it was very dark. The bright Petersburg summer nights were already beginning to close in, and but for the full moon, it would have been difficult to distinguish anything in Rogojin's dismal room, with the drawn blinds. They could just see one another's faces, however, though not in detail. Rogojin's face was white, as usual. His glittering eyes watched the prince with an intent stare. "Had you not better light a candle?" said Muishkin. "No, I needn't," replied Rogojin, and taking the other by the hand he drew him down to a chair. He himself took a chair opposite, and drew it up so close that he almost pressed against the prince's knees. At their side was a little round table. "Sit down," said Rogojin, "let's rest a bit." There was silence for a moment. "I knew you would be at that hotel," he continued, just as men sometimes commence a serious conversation by discussing any outside subject before leading up to the main point. "As I entered the passage, it struck me that perhaps you were sitting and waiting for me, just as I was waiting for you. Have you been to the old lady at Ismailovsky barracks?" "Yes," said the prince, squeezing the word out with difficulty owing to the dreadful beating of his heart. "I thought you would. They'll talk about it, I thought, so I determined to go and fetch you to spend the night here. We will be together, I thought, for this one night." "Rogojin, where is Nastasia Philipovna?" said the prince, suddenly rising from his seat. He was quaking in all his limbs, and his words came in a scarcely audible whisper. Rogojin rose also. "There," he whispered, nodding his head towards the curtain. "Asleep," whispered the prince. Rogojin looked intently at him again, as before. "Let's go in, but you mustn't. Well, let's go in." He lifted the curtain, paused, and turned to the prince. "Go in," he said, motioning him to pass behind the curtain. Muishkin went in. "It's so dark," he said. "You can see quite enough," muttered Rogojin. "I can just see there's a bed." "Go nearer," suggested Rogojin softly. The prince took a step forward, then another, and paused. He stood and stared for a minute or two. Neither of the men spoke a word while at the bedside. The prince's heart beat so loud that its knocking seemed to be distinctly audible in the deathly silence. But now his eyes had become so far accustomed to the darkness that he could distinguish the whole of the bed. Someone was asleep upon it, in an absolutely motionless sleep. Not the slightest movement was perceptible, not the faintest breathing could be heard. The sleeper was covered with a white sheet. The outline of the limbs was hardly distinguishable. He could only just make out that a human being lay outstretched there. All around, on the bed, on a chair beside it, on the floor, were scattered the different portions of a magnificent white silk dress, bits of lace, ribbons, and flowers. On a small table at the bedside glittered a mass of diamonds, torn off and thrown down anyhow. From under a heap of lace at the end of the bed peeped a small white foot, which looked as though it had been chiseled out of marble. It was terribly still. The prince gazed, and felt that the more he gazed, the more deathlike became the silence. Suddenly a fly awoke somewhere, buzzed across the room, and settled on the pillow. The prince shuddered. "Let's go," said Rogojin, touching his shoulder. They left the alcove and sat down in the two chairs they had occupied before, opposite to one another. The prince trembled more and more violently, and never took his questioning eyes off Rogojin's face. "I see you are shuddering, Lef Nicolaievitch," said the latter at length, "almost as you did once in Moscow before your fit, don't you remember? I don't know what I shall do with you." The prince bent forward to listen, putting all the strain he could muster upon his understanding in order to take in what Rogojin said, and continuing to gaze at the latter's face. "Was it you?" he muttered at last, motioning with his head towards the curtain. "Yes, it was I," whispered Rogojin, looking down. Neither spoke for 5 minutes. "Because, you know," Rogojin recommenced, as though continuing a former sentence, "if you were ill now, or had a fit, or screamed, or anything, they might hear it in the yard, or even in the street, and guess that someone was passing the night in the house. They would all come and knock and want to come in, because they know I am not at home. I didn't light a candle for the same reason. When I am not here, for 2 or 3 days at a time, now and then, no one comes in to tidy the house or anything. Those are my orders. So that I want them to not know we are spending the night here." "Wait," interrupted the prince. "I asked both the porter and the woman whether Nastasia Philipovna had spent last night in the house, so they knew." "I know you asked." "I told them that she had called in for 10 minutes and then gone straight back to Pavlovsk. No one knows she slept here. Last night we came in just as carefully as you and I did today. I thought as I came along with her that she would not like to creep in so secretly, but I was quite wrong. She whispered and walked on tiptoe, she carried her skirt over her arm so that it shouldn't rustle, and she held up her finger at me on the stairs so that I shouldn't make a noise. It was you she was afraid of. She was mad with terror in the train, and she begged me to bring her to this house. I thought of taking her to her rooms at the Ismailovsky barracks first, but she wouldn't hear of it. She said, 'No, not there, he'll find me out at once there. Take me to your own house, where you can hide me, and tomorrow we'll set off for Moscow.' Thence she would go to Orel, she said. When she went to bed, she was still talking about going to Orel." "Wait. What do you intend to do now, Parfen?" "Well, I'm afraid of you. You shudder and tremble so. We'll pass the night here together. There are no other beds besides that one, but I've thought how we'll manage. I'll take the cushions off all the sofas and lay them down on the floor, up against the curtain here, for you and me, so that we shall be together. For if they come in and look about now, you know, they'll find her and carry her away, and they'll be asking me questions, and I shall say I did it, and then they'll take me away too, don't you see? So let her lie close to us, close to you and me." "Yes, yes," agreed the prince warmly. "So we will not say anything about it, or let them take her away." "Not for anything," cried the other. "No, no, no." "So I had decided, my friend, not to give her up to anyone," continued Rogojin. "We'll be very quiet. I have only been out of the house 1 hour all day. All the rest of the time I have been with her. I dare say the air is very bad here. It is so hot. Do you find it bad?" "I don't know, perhaps. By morning it will be. I've covered her with oilcloth, best American oilcloth, and put the sheet over that, and 4 jars of disinfectant, on account of the smell, as they did at Moscow. You remember. And she's lying so still. You shall see in the morning when it's light." "What? Can't you get up?" asked Rogojin, seeing the other was trembling so that he could not rise from his seat. "My legs won't move," said the prince. "It's fear, I know. When my fear is over, I'll get up. Wait a bit, I'll make the bed, and you can lie down. I'll lie down too, and we'll listen and watch, for I don't know yet what I shall do. I tell you beforehand, so that you may be ready in case I—" Muttering these disconnected words, Rogojin began to make up the beds. It was clear that he had devised these beds long before. Last night, he slept on the sofa. But there was no room for two on the sofa, and he seemed anxious that he and the prince should be close to one another. Therefore, he now dragged cushions of all sizes and shapes from the sofas and made a sort of bed of them close by the curtain. He then approached the prince and gently helped him to rise and led him towards the bed. But the prince could now walk by himself, so that his fear must have passed. For all that, however, he continued to shudder. "It's hot weather, you see," continued Rogojin, as he lay down on the cushions beside Muishkin, "and naturally there will be a smell. I daren't open the window. My mother has some beautiful flowers in pots. They have a delicious scent. I thought of fetching them in, but that old servant will find out. She's very inquisitive." "Yes, she is inquisitive," assented the prince. "I thought of buying flowers and putting them all round her, but I was afraid it would make us sad to see her with flowers round her." "Look here," said the prince. He was bewildered and his brain wandered. He seemed to be continually groping for the questions he wished to ask, and then losing them. "Listen, tell me, how did you with a knife? That same one?" "Yes, that same one." "Wait a minute, I want to ask you something else, Parfin, all sorts of things. But tell me first, did you intend to kill her before my wedding at the church door with your knife?" "I don't know whether I did or not," said Rogojin dryly, seeming to be a little astonished at the question and not quite taking it in. "Did you never take your knife to Pavlovsk with you?" "No. As to the knife," he added, "this is all I can tell you about it." He was silent for a moment and then said, "I took it out of the locked drawer this morning about 3, for it was in the early morning all this happened. It has been inside the book ever since. And this is what is such a marvel to me. The knife only went in a couple of inches at most, just under her left breast, and there wasn't more than half a tablespoonful of blood altogether, not more." "Yes, yes, yes." The prince jumped up in extraordinary agitation. I know, I've read of that sort of thing. It's internal hemorrhage, you know. Sometimes there isn't a drop, if the blow goes straight to the heart." "Wait, listen," cried Rogojin, suddenly starting up. "Somebody's walking about, do you hear?" In the hall, both sat up to listen. "I hear," said the prince in a whisper, his eyes fixed on Rogojin. "Footsteps." "Yes." "Shall we shut the door and lock it or not?" "Yes, lock it." They locked the door and both lay down again. There was a long silence. "Yes, by the by," whispered the prince, hurriedly and excitedly as before, as though he had just seized hold of an idea and was afraid of losing it again. I wanted those cards. They say you played cards with her." "Yes, I played with her," said Rogojin after a short silence. "Where are the cards?" "Here they are," said Rogojin after a still longer pause. He pulled out a pack of cards, wrapped in a bit of paper, from his pocket and handed them to the prince. The latter took them with a sort of perplexity. A new, sad, helpless feeling weighed on his heart. He had suddenly realized that not only at this moment, but for a long while, he had not been saying what he wanted to say, had not been acting as he wanted to act. And that these cards which he held in his hand, and which he had been so delighted to have at first, were now of no use, no use. He rose and wrung his hands. Rogojin lay motionless, and seemed neither to hear nor see his movements, but his eyes blazed in the darkness and were fixed in a wild stare. The prince sat down on a chair and watched him in alarm. Half an hour went by. Suddenly Rogojin burst into a loud, abrupt laugh, as though he had quite forgotten that they must speak in whispers. "That officer, that young officer, don't you remember that fellow at the band?" Ha. Didn't she whip him smartly, The prince jumped up from his seat in renewed terror. When Rogojin quieted down, which he did at once, the prince bent over him, sat down beside him, and with painfully beating heart and still more painful breath, watched his face intently. Rogojin never turned his head and seemed to have forgotten all about him. The prince watched and waited. Time went on, it began to grow light. Rogojin began to wander, muttering disconnectedly. Then he took to shouting and laughing. The prince stretched out a trembling hand and gently stroked his hair and his cheeks. He could do nothing more. His legs trembled again, and he seemed to have lost the use of them. A new sensation came over him, filling his heart and soul with infinite anguish. Meanwhile, the daylight grew full and strong, and at last the prince lay down, as though overcome by despair, and laid his face against the white, motionless face of Rogojin. His tears flowed on to Rogojin's cheek, though he was perhaps not aware of them himself. At all events, when, after many hours, the door was opened and people thronged in, they found the murderer unconscious and in a raging fever. The prince was sitting by him, motionless, and each time that the sick man gave a laugh or a shout, he hastened to pass his own trembling hand over his companion's hair and cheeks, as though trying to soothe and quiet him. But alas, he understood nothing of what was said to him, and recognized none of those who surrounded him. If Schneider himself had arrived then and seen his former pupil and patient, remembering the prince's condition during the first year in Switzerland, he would have flung up his hands, despairingly, and cried, as he did then, "An idiot!" Roman 12. When the widow hurried away to Pavlovsk, she went straight to Darya Alexeyevna's house, and telling all she knew, threw her into a state of great alarm. Both ladies decided to communicate at once with Lebedev, who, as the friend and landlord of the prince, was also much agitated. Vera Lebedev told all she knew, and by Lebedev's advice, it was decided that all three should go to Petersburg as quickly as possible, in order to avert what might so easily happen. This is how it came about that at 11 o'clock next morning Rogojin's flat was opened by the police in the presence of Lebedev, the two ladies, and Rogojin's own brother, who lived in the wing. The evidence of the porter went further than anything else towards the success of Lebedev in gaining the assistance of the police. He declared that he had seen Rogojin return to the house last night, accompanied by a friend, and that both had gone upstairs very secretly and cautiously. After this, there was no hesitation about breaking open the door, since it could not be got open in any other way. Rogojin suffered from brain fever for 2 months. When he recovered from the attack, he was at once brought up on trial for murder. He gave full, satisfactory, and direct evidence on every point, and the prince's name was, thanks to this, not brought into the proceedings. Rogojin was very quiet during the progress of the trial. He did not contradict his clever and eloquent counsel, who argued that the brain fever, or inflammation of the brain, was the cause of the crime, clearly proving that this malady had existed long before the murder was perpetrated, and had been brought on by the sufferings of the accused. But Rogojin added no words of his own in confirmation of this view, and as before, he recounted with marvelous exactness the details of his crime. He was convicted, but with extenuating circumstances, and condemned to hard labor in Siberia for 15 years. He heard his sentence grimly, silently, and thoughtfully. His colossal fortune, with the exception of the comparatively small portion wasted in the first wanton period of his inheritance, went to his brother, to the great satisfaction of the latter. The old lady, Rogojin's mother, is still alive, and remembers her favorite son Parfen sometimes, but not clearly. God spared her the knowledge of this dreadful calamity which had overtaken her house. Lebedev, Keller, Gania, Titsin, and many other friends of ours continue to live as before. There is scarcely any change in them, so that there is no need to tell of their subsequent doings. Hippolyte died in great agitation, and rather sooner than he expected, about a fortnight after Nastasia Philipovna's death. Kolya was much affected by these events, and drew nearer to his mother in heart and sympathy. Nina Alexandrovna is anxious, because he is thoughtful beyond his years, but he will, we think, make a useful and active man. The prince's further fate was more or less decided by Kolya, who selected, out of all the persons he had met during the last 6 or 7 months, Evgeny Pavlovitch as friend and confidant. To him, he made over all that he knew as to the events above recorded, and as to the present condition of the prince. He was not far wrong in his choice. Evgeny Pavlovitch took the deepest interest in the fate of the unfortunate idiot. And, thanks to his influence, the prince found himself once more with Dr. Schneider in Switzerland. Evgeny Pavlovitch, who went abroad at this time, intending to live a long while on the continent, being, as he often said, quite superfluous in Russia, visits his sick friend at Schneider's every few months. But Dr. Schneider frowns ever more and more and shakes his head. He hints that the brain is fatally injured. He does not as yet declare that his patient is incurable, but he allows himself to express the gravest fears. Evgeny takes this much to heart, and he has a heart, as is proved by the fact that he receives and even answers letters from Kolya. But besides this, another trait in his character has become apparent, and as it is a good trait, we will make haste to reveal it. After each visit to Schneider's establishment, Evgeny Pavlovitch writes another letter, besides that to Kolya, giving the most minute particulars concerning the invalid's condition. In these letters is to be detected, and in each one more than the last, a growing feeling of friendship and sympathy. The individual who corresponds thus with Evgeny Pavlovitch, and who engages so much of his attention and respect, is Vera Lebedev. We have never been able to discover clearly how such relations sprang up. Of course, the root of them was in the events which we have already recorded, and which so filled Vera with grief on the prince's account that she fell seriously ill. But exactly how the acquaintance and friendship came about, we cannot say. We have spoken of these letters chiefly because in them is often to be found some news of the Epanchin family, and of Aglaya in particular. Evgeny Pavlovitch wrote of her from Paris that after a short and sudden attachment to a certain Polish count, an exile, she had suddenly married him, quite against the wishes of her parents, though they had eventually given their consent through fear of a terrible scandal. Then, after a 6 months' silence, Evgeny Pavlovitch informed his correspondent, in a long letter full of detail, that while paying his last visit to Dr. Schneider's establishment, he had there come across the whole Epanchin family, excepting the general, who had remained in St. Petersburg, and Princess. The meeting was a strange one. They all received Evgeny Pavlovitch with effusive delight. Adelaida and Alexandra were deeply grateful to him for his angelic kindness to the unhappy prince. Lizaveta Prokofyevna, when she saw poor Muishkin, in his enfeebled and humiliated condition, had wept bitterly. Apparently, all was forgiven him. Princess had made a few just and sensible remarks. It seemed to Evgeny Pavlovitch that there was not yet perfect harmony between Adelaida and her fiancé, but he thought that in time the impulsive young girl would let herself be guided by his reason and experience. Besides, the recent events that had befallen her family had given Adelaida much to think about, especially the sad experiences of her younger sister. Within 6 months, everything that the family had dreaded from the marriage with the Polish count had come to pass. He turned out to be neither count nor exile, at least in the political sense of the word, but had had to leave his native land owing to some rather dubious affair of the past. It was his noble patriotism, of which he made a great display, that had rendered him so interesting in Aglaya's eyes. She was so fascinated that, even before marrying him, she joined a committee that had been organized abroad to work for the restoration of Poland. And further, she visited the confessional of a celebrated Jesuit priest who made an absolute fanatic of her. The supposed fortune of the count had dwindled to a mere nothing, although he had given almost irrefutable evidence of its existence to Lizaveta Prokofyevna and Princess. Besides this, before they had been married half a year, the count and his friend the priest managed to bring about a quarrel between Aglaya and her family, so that it was now several months since they had seen her. In a word, there was a great deal to say, but Mrs. Epanchin and her daughters, and even Princess, were still so much distressed by Aglaya's latest infatuations and adventures that they did not care to talk of them, though they must have known that Evgeny knew much of the story already. Poor Lizaveta Prokofyevna was most anxious to get home, and, according to Evgeny's account, She criticized everything foreign with much hostility. They can't bake bread anywhere decently, and they all freeze in their houses during winter like a lot of mice in a cellar. At all events, I've had a good Russian cry over this poor fellow, she added, pointing to the prince, who had not recognized her in the slightest degree. So enough of this nonsense, it's time we face the truth. All this continental life, all this Europe of yours, and all the trash about, going abroad is simply foolery, and it is mere foolery on our part to come. Remember what I say, my friend, you'll live to agree with me yourself. So spoke the good lady, almost angrily, as she took leave of Evgeny Pavlovitch.